Well, as Alistair was saying a short time ago, jurors at the Old Bailey heard how a blood stain found on a jacket belonging to one of the men accused of murdering Stephen Lawrence was caused when the blood was wet. Our correspondent Ronke Phillips was in court, and Ronke, this really is a significant development.
Yes, thanks, Natasha. It is. The tiny blood stain, measuring less than 1 millimetre squared, was discovered on the jacket collar belonging to Gary Dobson. He's accused with David Norris of the 18-year-old's murder. Today was day 11 of the trial. The tiny blood stain discovered on the collar of a jacket belonging to one of the men accused of murdering Stephen Lawrence. The prosecution argue it could only have got there if Gary Dobson was at the scene. The stain was found by Edward Jarman, a forensic scientist who looked at all the evidence as part of a cold case review. Mr. Jarman said if the blood found on Dobson's jacket had been old when it made contact, it would not have soaked in. Further tests showed the blood had a probability of less than 1 in a billion of not belonging to Stephen Lawrence. Mr. Jarman told the court it was a very small stain. It appeared absorbed into the actual fabric of the material. Prosecution barrister Mark Ellison QC then asked, what is the mechanism by which something that's wet gets absorbed into fabric? Mr. Jarman replied, wet material gets drawn in. It wicks along fibres absorbing into material. Mr. Ellison asked, you examined that fragment quite closely. Can you help us with that? Mr. Jarman said, we dissected it. The blood was wet when those fibres came to be there. Mr. Jarman was then asked about the probability of the stain getting onto the jacket from another source. He said given the amount of blood on Stephen's jacket and other clothing, any transfer would have to have happened shortly after the attack. And he said, as I've laid out, given the number of steps involved and the possible quantities of blood, it seems to me an implausible explanation. Gary Dobson and David Norris are alleged to have been among a group of white men who forced Stephen Lawrence to the ground at a bus stop in Eltham in southeast London and stabbed him twice. They claim the forensic evidence linking them to the crime resulted from contamination, but the prosecution says tiny amounts of blood, fibre and hair found on clothes taken from their homes proves their guilt.
So, Ronke, a very important day for the prosecution then?
Yes, today really was at the heart of the prosecution case. Mr. Jarman told the jury that he'd spent an entire day inspecting Gary Dobson's jacket, and of course that breakthrough came when he found that tiny speck of blood. Just to show you how small it was, the measurements were 0.5 millimetres by 0.25 millimetres. And the jury was shown a magnified image of the blood spot next to a 10-pence coin, and it's the size of just 2 ridges on the edge of that coin, so really, really minute, Natasha. Both Doreen and Nevin Lawrence were in court again today, listening intently as Mr. Jarman gave his evidence. The accused, I suppose I could describe them as being impassive. It's day 12 tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Ronke. Thank you. Olympic